My name is Morgan McVey, and welcome to Risk Management Professionals webinar series. My co-presenter, Ivan, will be jumping on midway through the presentation, and our producers, Max and Karine, will be in the background, keeping us operational and taking questions. A few housekeeping items. We're using a GoToWebinar interface to support our presentation. If you experience technical difficulties, please contact our office at 877-532-0806. We have staff available to help with troubleshooting. The image sizes for the presenter's screen and PowerPoint presentation are adjustable. We also have a dialog box for questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them in the question box, and after the presentation, we'll include them in our question and answer session. This webinar series is part of RMP's ongoing outreach program. RMP's core competencies and expertise reside in EPA RMP, OSHA PSM, CalARP, and SEMS program development, HAZOP and LOPA studies and other hazard identification techniques, and a variety of other process safety and regulatory standards and regulations. Before we get into the presentation, I want to provide a quick overview of our company. We specialize in many aspects of process safety and risk management, including RMP and PSM submittals, conducting PHA and HAZOP studies, along with providing support for CalARP and CAP programs. The rest of our services can be found on our website. For today's webinar, we'll be focusing on 2 of the 14 elements of RMP PSM, specifically MOC and PSSR, and how the new California regulations affect them, as well as the common deficiencies we see. Getting right into it, a quick summary of this presentation. What is an MOC? MOC stands for Management of Change, and this is performed for not in-kind changes to the process. A change is defined in OSHA 3313 as an alteration or adjustment to any component, variable, or property within an existing system, except those within clearly defined boundaries or responsibilities. PSSR stands for Pre-Startup Safety Review, and this is a checklist to verify all these changes were performed correctly and that safety is a top priority. These are elements of the CalARP and RMP Program 3 and PSM Cal-OSHA requirements. In today's webinar, we'll cover some common deficiencies we find with regards to these elements and what you can do to comply. I'll briefly state exactly what the CalARP, Cal-OSHA, EPA, and OSHA says in the documentation about an MOC and when it should be performed. First, from the EPA, the owner or operator shall establish and implement written procedures to manage changes, except for replacement in kind, to process chemicals, technology, equipment, and procedures, and changes to stationary sources that affect a covered process. Everyone should be aware of the basic process changes that require an MOC. However, some less known examples of MOC include the following: changes to maintenance procedures, changes to testing and inspection maintenance frequencies, changes in engineering or equipment specifications, changes to safety devices and alarm set points, including changes to process control software, changes with respect to organizational changes that affect process safety, and changes to operating conditions that are not within the current operating limits. There are 3 variations of MOCs that I will briefly touch upon that are listed on the slide. The first are permanent MOCs, which include changes to the system that are permanent and must have established time limits on how long an approved MOC can exist without being implemented before it is voided or re-reviewed or re-approved. Temporary changes require an MOC. Temporary MOCs must have steps required to return the process to its approved status when a temporary change has expired, along with a minimum duration allowed for temporary changes, beyond which additional authorizations are needed. If a facility has an emergency rapid verbal approval, MOC procedures should be available. The procedures must clearly outline the specific circumstances that constitute as an emergency, identify the approvers who must verbally authorize the change, and how and when the normal MOC documentation is to be prepared during the next business day. Furthermore, these MOC provisions should be used sparingly and never when the normal approvers required by the MOC procedures are on-site or otherwise physically available. MOC procedures shall assure that the following considerations are addressed prior to any change: the technical basis for the change, the impact of the change on safety and health, the necessary time period to implement the change, and authorization requirements for a proposed change. This usually includes the originator, the ops supervisor, and plant supervisor. Employees involved in operating a process, maintenance personnel, and contract employees whose job tasks will be affected by a change in the process shall be informed of and trained in the change prior to startup of the process or affected part of the process. In addition, this should be documented in some way. If a change results in a change to the process safety information, such information shall be updated accordingly. If an MOC results in a change to the operating procedures and/or results in a change to the written procedures to maintain the ongoing integrity of process equipment, such procedures or practices shall be updated and trained upon prior to startup of the process. The MOC should ensure that the impact of change on safety and health be evaluated and that any identified issues be addressed prior to making the change. However, it should be noted that a PHA specifically is not mandatory to assess the impact of a change on safety and health, but it is highly recommended to ensure a comprehensive review of the MOC takes place. Whether PHA is required for an MOC oftentimes is determined by internal company regulations. However, we have outlined a general standard guidance based on level determination. So we've got 3 levels outlined on the slide before you. Level 3 would constitute either a new process or a change that involves the addition or removal of a modification of multiple pieces of different types of equipment in a single unit. This is a large enough change to the process where a hazard and operability study, the HAZOP, must be warranted. Level 2 would be classified by any of the following characteristics: increased chemical storage inventory, modification of piping and valving arrangements, change in specifications, change of pressure, temperature, flow, level outside of normal operating range, changes to safety systems or alarms, new modes of operation, etc. Any of these changes would warrant a what-if review. Level 1 would be classified as anything left over. For example, minor changes to the system, and can be reviewed using a checklist. These would have to be predetermined checklists based on the specific type of equipment. These MOC PHAs should be treated as a 5-year reval PHA, where the facilitator of these types of reviews should be familiar with the methodology being used, and personnel knowledgeable in the process should be present. For example, operations, maintenance personnel, and engineering personnel. Lastly, ensure that there is sufficient time allotted for these types of reviews. About 1 hour for a checklist, 1 to 4 hours for a what-if, and 1 day to multiple weeks for a HAZOP, depending upon the process. And then lastly, recommendations must be closed before the MOC is implemented and the process is started up. Here's a visual diagram that depicts the MOC procedure flow path. When an MOC is being performed, usually the system is fully shut down. For this process, a pre-startup safety review is performed before the system is started up again. So now we're going to go into some CalART Program 4 elements. So CalART Program 4 only applies to refineries in California. If you're not a refinery, these changes do not apply to you. These are always good practices to follow if your company has the tools and resources to implement them. But Program 3 facilities, which are not California refineries, are not held accountable to these rule changes. All requirements listed in Program 3 are captured in Program 4, and most of the additions to the MOC regulations are for consistency with changes to the regulations. For example, Program 4 facilities are required to perform damage mechanism reviews every 5 years, so the MOC now requires the facility to do a damage mechanism review with an MOC on the parts of the process that can be affected. This might catch corrosion problems associated with increasing the temperature of a process fluid. CalART Program 4 has a more rigorous version of MOC and PSSR. The first big change is the addition of the MOOC for the organizational changes. Procedures must be developed to manage these changes in personnel. This will be discussed later in this presentation. Program 4 specifically states conducting an MOC for temporary repairs, including piping and equipment repairs. We recommend having an MOC program for these types of repairs if you are Program 3 or even 2, but Program 4 specifically requires this in the regulations. The Program 4 facilities will have to not only perform a safety review, but also need to include a DMR and HCA in the MOC documentation, which we recommend being done in tandem with the PHA if one is required. MOC is not a standalone regulation, but rather relies on having all other elements of CalARP completed to maximize the effectiveness of MOC. So now we'll move on to common MOC deficiencies. So before we get into the deficiencies we just mentioned, here are some common line items missed in the MOC form, just for your reference. Personnel and organizational changes aren't considered. Temporary changes, such as time limits, mechanisms to follow through, are missed. And failure to review MOCs with employees and contractors. So there are three main deficiencies associated with MOCs, and we'll discuss each one in detail. The first one is the MOC procedure is not correctly being implemented or not used, such as confusion over replacement in kind versus not in kind change. Program documentation not updated to reflect a change, such as PSI, PNIDs, SOPs, and mechanical integrity. And then failure to review MOCs with employees and contractors. So the first one is MOC procedures not correctly implemented, and some common issues include confusion regarding like in kind. For example, facilities often consider changing a pump to a slightly different pump, a like in kind change. However, this is not the case. For it to be considered a like in kind, it needs to be the exact same pump type. Therefore, for this situation, an MOC must be completed. The next common issue is with regards to temporary changes. Temporary changes constitute as a change, and therefore an MOC must be conducted, and you follow the same process. There's been some confusion regarding this as well. Lastly, there is missing required authorizations for the MOC or MOC forms not being correctly filled out. Breaking down the common cause issue could be that the MOC procedure is not current or used. The problem is often that the MOC procedures are too complicated and not intuitive or too simple, and basically a rubber stamp doc solution. So there's some solutions listed below. Engage departments in the development of procedure that matches the complexity of the process. Clearly define roles, provide the flow chart associated with procedural steps, and provide examples of like in kind versus not in kind changes. Second, the program documentation is often not updated. The solution to fix this is first to maintain a master copy of the program documentation and always update revisions to modified documents, to maintain equipment manuals, UNA forms, etc., to keep files associated with MOC forms and develop an MOC packet. Also, keeping digital copies to reduce the risk of losing files is recommended. The next one is failure to review MOCs with employees and contractors. So ensure that MOC procedure requires training on any affected procedures or changes in process parameters for both employees and contractors. Even if a change does not result in any procedural change, conduct an overview and document. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. So here's some general tips for MOCs. Many of these deficiencies can be fixed through training for facility management and operations, maintenance, and contractors on facility MOC process. Training should emphasize when MOC process should be used and incorporate the use of MOCs into the culture of the facility. Although the program is often overseen by 1 or 2 personnel for the facility, all operators and managers should be familiar with MOC process. Training should emphasize roles and responsibilities as well. And to cover MOOC, I'll hand it off to my co-presenter, Ivan Cheng.
Sorry, we're doing some production issues there, so just before we get started here again. Thank you, Morgan. And management of organizational change, also known as an MOOC, requires its own documentation and procedures. The following requirements, according to a quote directly from regulations, states that the owner or operator shall designate a team to conduct a management of organizational change assessment prior to reducing staffing levels, reducing classification levels of employees, changing shift duration, or substantively increasing employees' responsibilities at or above 15%. The MOOC assessment is required only for changes with a duration exceeding 90 calendar days, affecting operations, engineering, maintenance, health and safety, and emergency response. This requirement shall also apply to stationary sources using contractors in permanent positions. This is something that's only being recommended for all facilities to do. However, it's being required for all California refineries. The MOOC report requires a description of the change being proposed. The team evaluating the change is documented, and it needs to show a team with people of different areas of expertise. The factors evaluated by the team and the reasoning for the decision the team makes considering the MOOC, and the findings and recommendations to let the decision to go forward. In essence, the MOOC is attempting to ensure that human factors are considered, and that's why you want a variety of a team of different expertise, to make sure that all their input is considered and you haven't missed anything from a human factor standpoint, and that the plant manager or personnel directed by the plant manager confirm the accuracy of the report. The goal of this is to prevent staff reduction and consolidation of responsibilities from compromising the safety of the facility. CCPS has provided guidance on some of the common issues arising during organization change and why it's important. So some of the key issues here are work overload in a new organization. And essentially what this means is that when you do decide to make an organizational change, oftentimes it's for companies to consolidate responsibilities or to readjust responsibilities. So when you decide to consolidate responsibilities, for example, if someone is going from having a facility where every element of CalARP, RMP, PSM, so 14 elements are split between an individual person, so 14 different people, and you consolidate it down to being one person in charge of all 14 elements, and they have their normal day job that they had before, you can have the issue of having a tremendous work overload where before it was split between 14, now you have one person doing it. So they have to take care of their day tasks, day job still, and take care of all 14 elements. It's just a tremendous amount of workload that you're adding onto it. And even if you go with something less extreme, such as just reducing it from 14 people to 10 people, it's still an increase on their workload strain that you need to evaluate and make sure that they're able to meet those requirements that are being asked of them, and you're not causing them to have so much work that things start slipping between the cracks. A next common issue is lack of transition plans, and this is often most often occurs when someone leaves that's been in the position for 20, 30 years and retires. That person might be the only person that ever looks at your CalARP RMP PSM program, and so when they leave, the facility is now left with the job of trying to take care of this program that no one used to do, and they'll assign it to someone new, and they won't have trained them. There won't be then a transition plan from the person who's been there 30 years to the person who's now taking on this program for the first time ever. So they might not understand how things are organized. They might not understand what they need to do, the due dates. So you want to have some kind of transition plan, either to have some procedures in place or to have someone waiting in the wings, essentially, if one person's going to be in charge of everything, that they've done a knowledge transfer, essentially, before they leave, so that you don't have as much of this issue. And then shift of office location. So something as simple as deciding to centralize things into a corporate location, sometimes moving your engineering department off plant to this corporate location, which might only be 20 minutes away, so same city, but just a little bit off plant. Those can have tremendous impacts that aren't always considered. Now, if you have an incident and you need engineering response and everyone is in the corporate office, for example, then there won't be anyone there immediately to help, right? They still have to travel 20 minutes, or they'll have to figure out how to do it remotely. So you're kind of leaving your operators to have to figure it out. And so oftentimes what happens when things like that occur is even if operations and engineering are used to working closely together when everyone was on plant together, there starts to be a breakdown in communication just due to the natural physical breakdown of the barrier of location. It's not as convenient, and thus operations sometimes just ends up feeling that engineering doesn't quite understand their needs and they don't take it as seriously. And then even if you decide to move everyone on plant, there's other things you have to consider there, from a facility siting issue, or personnel now having to be located near process equipment in a way that isn't acceptable from a safety standpoint. So it's just things to consider when you do something even as simple as shifting office location. And then kind of to tie in all of this is post-implementation monitoring. So you want to have a strong post-implementation monitoring program in place so that you can make sure that with your new organizational chart that everyone understands what they have been assigned to do and that they're actually doing it. Are there forms being not completed? Are things slipping through the cracks? Are the people who are taking on the new roles able to fill out the forms the way that it used to be filled out, and such that you're maintaining your safety with your new organizational chart? And then the final thing that kind of ties into this is competing accountabilities, essentially also known as the bystander effect, right? Kind of represented by the depiction shown on the screen there, where there are 5 people staring at one person on the ground, but no one's doing anything to help. When you have multiple people that are responsible for the same thing, what will often happen is that they'll assume the other person will do it. So you want to make sure that if you have someone in charge of the MOC program and you're going to have another person overall responsible for the MOC program, that the responsibilities are clearly accounted for so that they understand what they need to do, and it isn't the assumption that someone else will take care of it. So the CSB recommends that all facilities have a MOC procedure, as the lack of this procedure has been a core finding for multiple incidents. So the kind of key takeaway here is even if you're not a refinery, this is something you should consider doing. MOCs currently do require an MOC on organizational changes, which Morgan touched on a little bit, and that affect the covered process. So that's kind of the key caveat there, is if your organizational change will affect your covered process in some way, you should do an MOC on it, and it's flagged by OSHA PSM in a 2009 interpretation letter. So PSSR. A PSSR, known as a pre-startup safety review, is required for a new facility or when there's a change to the process that causes a change in the PSI. As Morgan touched on, MOCs are required when you have a change that's not a replacement in kind. So those two definitions are pretty similar. You rarely have a change that causes a change in your PSI that's not a replacement in kind, right? So a lot of times what facilities will do is combine these two elements together into one program. However, it's important to remember that PSSRs are their own element, especially with the change to regulations for refineries. But it's important to think of PSSR as its own thing and not just to think of it as a MOC or MOC plus PSSR, which is something that we commonly see, is that operators will know exactly what an MOC means, but they won't always remember what a PSSR is, because what's kind of emphasized is the management of change process. So kind of touch on that, right? So what is the PSSR exactly? It's a process verification in the essence, essentially. So it needs to be independent of the MOC, right? So kind of what we touched on is they're often combined with the MOC process, but it needs to be independent, essentially. And what that means is that you don't just rely on the MOC form to say, you look through it and go, okay, they've done the operator procedures check, they've done the safety review, they've done the construction according to the MOC form, right? It should be a team that looks through on their own without looking at the MOC form to make sure that all the construction materials match the design specification. You've updated your safety, operating, maintenance, emergency procedures as you said you would have, right? And that those procedures exist before you start up, and then that operators have been trained on those procedures, right? So you should be able to see that there have been training record forms, and then that a safety review has been done if one's required, and then you should be able to evaluate to see have the recommendations been taken care of as they needed to be, have they all been addressed, have they been closed out all of this should be done before you start up, exactly as the name implies. So kind of touch on the program 4 differences. And this is, again, why it's important to think of PSSR as its own element. You don't just think of it as MOC, right? Especially for program 4 now, you're required to do them for partial and unplanned shutdowns and turnarounds. So a lot of times you don't actually make any changes when you're doing these things, right? When you have an unplanned shutdown, sometimes it's just a spurious trip. You figure out a way to start back up. Nothing's changed, but you still need to do a PSSR now and make sure that the system is safe and that nothing's been missed when you just decided to start up. Maybe there was an underlying cause for this, right? So that's why you're required to do them on your own, and it's important to remember that it is its own element. And then the other kind of changes that have come as a result of Program 4 are more just to keep consistent with the new regulations. So DMR, HCA, SPA needs to be included in the MOC process, and recommendations need to be implemented or resolved before startup. And then process equipment must be confirmed to be operating in design specifications. So it kind of ties in with construction checks, but now they're specifically calling out you need to make sure that if you're going to start up and you've made changes or shutdowns have occurred, that when you start up, you're operating within your safe design limits and not running, let's say, just pressure above MAWP or running flow rates beyond what your system can handle. So some common PSSR deficiencies. So a lot of these deficiencies are similar to the ones Morgan has touched on already a little bit because MOC and PSSR, like I said, they're very closely related. So a lot of times you'll have the same similar types of deficiencies. So something kind of more unique here is written procedures don't exist for pre-startup safety review, right? Like I said, a lot of times facilities will combine these two programs together, which is completely acceptable. But when you do that, you should still have a very clear written procedure on what is required when you do your pre-startup safety review. PSSR documentation is not completed or kept on file following implementation of MOC procedure. So a lot of times people remember that they need to keep the MOC form, but they do the PSSR check and then they throw away the PSSR saying, okay, we're good. There's a checkbox saying we did one on the MOC, let's move on. But when someone comes in to audit your program, or if you have an incident in the worst case, right? When an auditor or regulator comes in to look at has a PSSR been done, if you haven't completed the form or you don't have documentation held on record, you can't show that someone went through, did the check. So you want to make sure that you fully complete it and keep it on file, right? And then the other one that we see quite a bit, and this kind of ties in, is documentation is not completed and signed off until after startup. Because like I said, people forget about the PSSR. A lot of times they are in a rush to start up the MOC. They say, we finished all the MOC form, we just start up. And they forget that they need to do the PSSR check. So this is, again, something we see a lot. So you have to remember, it's in the name, right? Pre-startup safety review. You need to finish the form before you start up. And then the last one is operators aren't trained on the PSSR documentation, right? So a lot of times what happens is everyone just remembers the MOC portion and they forget that the PSSR is a portion. So you want to make sure when you're doing your training that you emphasize that as part of the MOC procedure, you do need to do a PSSR before you start up. All right, so an example of kind of what we've been touching on these deficiencies, in 2008, a runaway reaction occurred in a 4,500-gallon drum known as the residue treater vessel at the methanol unit owned by Bayer Crop Science in Institute, West Virginia. The incident resulted in 2 fatalities and 8 injuries. This incident occurred after an extended outage to upgrade the control system and replace the original residue treater vessel. So the intention behind this change was to improve safety, right? They're trying to upgrade the control system so that the system runs more smoothly and that you replace the old residue treater vessel with a new one, right? So in theory, all you've been doing is increasing safety and efficiency, plant operations, obviously, right? That's also important to remember. But CSB identified multiple deficiencies that are outlined in the report that can be found on the CSB website, but we want to just focus on one of their key points, which was Bayer did not apply the standard pre-startup safety review and turnover practices to the methanol control system redesign project. The equipment was not tested and calibrated before the unit was restarted. It was also mentioned that operators were not well trained in the new operations and they bypassed critical safety devices, and temporary changes were never evaluated. So it's important to remember that even if you're doing something that you would think is increasing the safety of the plant and the operation, you have to make sure that you're verifying that you've done everything correctly, right? So if they had done the PSSR form, they would have caught that operators weren't trained. They didn't quite understand how to use the process. They would have evaluated in a safety review if it was okay to start up with the critical safety devices bypass, and if they had figured out a procedure to do it safely so that this terrible accident wouldn't have occurred, right? So it's important to remember that there are ramifications for not doing these things, and that's why they exist. And then so some just general tips for PSSR implementation for closeout is you want to make sure you archive your initial PSSR for your new facilities, right? So when you first start up for the very first time, you should have a safety review form, and you should archive it. And then completed checklist should either reference the MOC number or attach the MOC package, right? And this is kind of just to help you make sure you don't lose the PSSR form and you hold on to it because you're required to. And then if PSSR are also includes a safety review specification checklist, implement a prioritization ranking to define an order. That way you can make sure you're closing everything out that you need to. And then reference PSSR completion requirement in the MOC procedure. Again, this is just to further emphasize the point that when you do your MOC, you need to do a PSSR. And so by having a reference between the form that people more often remember, it helps them remember to do the secondary form. That kind of closes out at least our presentation on MOC and PSSR common deficiencies. So we have some upcoming webinars and conferences. So we have the Inherently Safer Design webinar on March 13th, 2018, presented by Jasmine Dhaliwal and Sarah Willman. We'll have a March 27th, 2018 webinar on Safeguard Protection Analysis for CalArt Program 4, presented by Steve Marr and John Johnson. And we'll have an April 10th webinar, The Importance of P&IDs and Labeling, presented by Max Opendahl, and we'll be at the IAR National Conference and the 14th Global Conference on Process Safety. So if you're going to attend one of these conferences, feel free to stop by our booth and ask us any questions that you might have. All right, so any questions? And just before we get into questions, just to remind for the audience, the audio and PowerPoint presentation are being recorded and will be available for viewing in about a week. All right.
Okay, hello. We good? Okay. So the first question is, are authorizations required for PSSRs or just MOCs?
So you want me to take this or? Okay. All right. So by the regulations, it's not specifically called out that you need to have an authorization for your PSSR form. It's mentioned specifically for MOCs. However, it's best practice to make sure that since you're going through and doing all these checks, that you have someone on the PSSR team sign off and authorize that they've done all of it, right? And then you also generally just want to have someone authorize that it's safe to start up. So you want a secondary check there, right? So that you have two people basically signing off and showing that you've gone through the form and that you can show and prove that you did this. So generally not required, but it is best practice.
Next question. Okay. Can you exercise rapid verbal approval MOCs without having a specific MOC procedure in place?
All right.
In order to exercise this type of emergency MOC, you absolutely have to have a procedure in place. There's multiple things that need to be included within that procedure, such as what constitutes as an emergency and who is approved to step in and make that decision in that situation, and then also when the actual MOC documentation will be prepared. And these are all elements that will be discussed within the procedure. And so you do need to have a procedure in place to exercise that type of MOC.
That's all the questions, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for attending.